that, and I think I'm not coming through my headset, which is interesting. But here we are, and all is well. Okay, let's begin. This is session number 8 in an introduction to biblical prophecy with an emphasis on Daniel and the book of Revelation. I'm Dr. John McMath, joined here by my friends in Italy and in the Philippines. And this session is being recorded and will show up on Facebook and YouTube. I should have links for everything, but I don't know how to do that. But you can find some of you younger folks that know how everything works have always been able to find these things that I have trouble hiding. Okay, let's begin. We're in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel, and the early part of this chapter, down through verse 19, is Daniel's prayer, first of confession and then of request for his people. And it's interesting. It's actually really important, but it's not the slightest bit controversial. But we'll take a look at that. The last bit of this chapter, from verses 20 through 27, is the so-called 70 weeks prophecy. 70 weeks for your people and for your holy city. And the interpretation of that is all over the canvas. It's every kind of interpretation you can imagine. And it comes down to a question of first principles. If biblical prophecy is God communicating through his prophets the outworking of his purpose in history, we would expect that communication would be clear enough that we could understand on some level. There are some bits of biblical prophecy that I will admit, and most students will admit, are difficult. But the vast majority of biblical prophecy does have a clear, literal meaning if you're willing to stop there. I believe that if we approach this chapter according to common sense understanding of the passage, it actually yields very good sense. It makes excellent sense, and we can demonstrate the interconnectedness of this passage with many other passages of Scripture only if we understand this passage in the plain, literal way. This is Daniel communicating with God, God communicating back to Daniel with a message delivered by an angel, which I recognize, if you don't believe in God or angels, then this becomes a very difficult passage. Nevertheless, if an angel actually came and talked to Daniel and gave him this message, then would assume this is a fairly important message. It's one that we should pay some attention to. And it seems to lay out a bit of history that is climactic and therefore important for us to understand. And the difficulty is found if you believe, one, that the Bible doesn't need to be interpreted literally, and two, because of that, we can interpret the Old Testament prophecies about Israel as prophecies about the church or some kind of spiritual allegorical dimension of the church. If we admit to that, then I agree this is the dismal swamp of Old Testament prophecy, because there's no way to sort out the various interpretations that are made. But if there's a difference between Israel and the church, and if God is working out his plan for both the church and for Israel. And his prophecies are to be understood as a clear communication, then I find that this chapter really works well, and it helps us to understand God's purposes in history. That's the direction I'm going to come from. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the alternative interpretations because I don't find any of them convincing. I'll mention a couple of places where it's glaring, but mostly I won't bother with that too much. Okay, having said all of that, the first part of this chapter, when we begin at chapter 1 or chapter 9 and verse 1, it sets up the timestamp. You know, it's like a camera will sometimes have a timestamp on it that tells you, when the picture was taken. So these chapters of Daniel's dreams and visions, beginning in chapter 7, all have timestamps, and these are in order. Chapter 9, the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. So that this lays out a fairly distinct year. This is 537 BC, and or 535, depends on how, and it doesn't matter very much. But at any rate, obviously close to the end of Daniel's life. Earlier in chapter 6, we see Daniel in the lion's den. It's this same king, the same Darius, who is the Persian king. So this is the after the end of the Babylonian time, the beginning of the Persian time, and Daniel says that he'd been studying the books, and by that he means the books of the prophets. It says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of the years according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, that must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Okay, there's a lot of language in that passage. It's actually fairly important for understanding what we're looking at. One, Daniel was a student of prophecy. Well, this means that Daniel had access, at least to some of the scrolls of the Old Testament. These were out and about. Daniel was reading this and studying these things because, as far as Daniel appears to be concerned, the prophets have a practical application to his own circumstances. The biblical prophets are not irrelevant. They are rather at the center of God's revelation of his own plans. The point seems to be that Daniel believed that God would speak through his servants, the prophets, in a clear and understandable way, and that he ought to be able to make plans on the basis of what God had promised. Okay, now that's not unreasonable. That's actually quite literally reasonable. Okay. And that's a beginning point for us. So Daniel was looking at that. This particular prophecy, as I recall, in the 25th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is an interesting book, but it's often difficult. Jeremiah can be depressing to read because Jeremiah was he was in Jerusalem during the fall of the city and of the nation to the Babylonians. Jeremiah actually survived the destruction of the city. This was a terrible thing. And that 587 BC destruction literally happened. Jeremiah had predicted that that would literally happen. And that day now begins the desolation of Jerusalem. The captivity actually begins in 606 BC, and it was a few years before the city was destroyed. For our purposes, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Jeremiah says that the desolation of Jerusalem will continue through 70 years. Okay, and that's important because 70 there is a clear number. 70 means 70, years means years, and 70 years is equal to, well, 70 years. Daniel was interpreting this prophecy literally. There's not Jerusalem here is not understood as the allegorical people of God of every era or something like that. And 70 is not allegorized as a very long time during the church age or something. It's literally talking about the trampling down of and then the destruction of Jerusalem. And the question is, how long will it be before God remembers his promise and allows the people of Israel to come back to the land? Now, that actually happens in 525 BC. But measuring that 70 years is a little difficult because people came back at various times in various ways and for purposes that are kind of fun to argue about. But the 70 years is a conventional number that is about 7 decades between the beginning of that destruction and the allowance of the Jewish people to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It's that rebuilding of the temple that's an important thing in this context, because then they will have an independent place. So the number of years, according to the word of Jeremiah, 70 years, the desolation of Jerusalem, a destroyed place with no temple. So remember that what Nebuchadnezzar did was to destroy the walls of the city, and to destroy much of the infrastructure of the city, including the Temple Mount. So the revetment wall around the outside of the Temple Mount, and then the temple itself and the surrounding porticos and other structures were destroyed, not one stone left on another, literally. And the end of the desolation has to be the allowance of the people of Israel to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild that temple. So that's what we're talking about. And Daniel, in this prayer, begins by talking to God in the verse 4. And he spends the majority of this time, all the way down through verse 17, talking about the sin of his people, confessing his own sin and confessing the sin of his people. And we could walk through this. The emphasis of Daniel's prayer is that we as the people of God have failed to live up to what we know to be true about God's purposes. We've failed to live up to the law that God has given us. God revealed the law in the Ten Commandments and in the exposition of that for the time and place, which we call the statutes and the ordinances and the commandments that fill up biblical law. Those are designed for Israel at their time in history and their place in the world. The Ten Commandments are universal and they apply to everybody everywhere. It's the obedience to those 10 first principles that Daniel is really talking about. He says we've failed to be proper reflections of the character of God himself. By failing to obey the law, we have failed to glorify God. And our calling in life, God's purpose for us in life, is to make God visible in the world, to glorify God, and thus to be a blessing in the larger world. That's the point. Daniel goes to great lengths to explain that, to lay it out. To a very large extent, Daniel is confessing to falling short of the glory of God. And of course, we all do. We all need to pray like this sometimes. Lord, we've fallen short of the perfection you expect of us, and we can hardly avoid that. So please, Lord, forgive us. Help us to live in a way that's better. And all of us can afford a prayer like that once in a while. That Daniel in particular is looking at this. He says, Lord, because of our sin, we have suffered these 70 years, and you are righteous and just to impose that upon us. But the time is up. It's time now to bring your people home. So the point is 70 years and God's promise of 70 years and Daniel's agreement that God has done the right thing and that now he must fulfill his promises. Beginning in about verse 16, oh Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, and your holy hill. Because for our sins and iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among the nations, all who are around us. Now, therefore, O God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy, and for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. So the desolation of Jerusalem has to do with really the trampling down of the Gentiles. This is all the first segment of the time of the Gentiles, this desolation of Jerusalem. The focus is on the people of Israel and the holy hill, Mount Zion, the place of the temple. So that's what we're looking for. That's what Daniel was asking about. In verses 20 through 23, we've got the story about Gabriel coming. So while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, presenting my plea before God for the holy hill of my God, which is Jerusalem, of course. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I'd seen in vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. Now, there was no sacrifice going on in Babylon, but Daniel knew what time of day this was supposed to be. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, oh, Daniel, I've come now to give you insight and understanding. Insight is the sudden aha moment that you have when you've been studying something really hard, and finally all of the pieces begin to drop into their slots. That's a very cool thing when it happens. Finally getting there. And now, once you see everything falling into the slots, you look at the whole picture and you understand That is, you finally see the pattern that has been formed. Okay, so this is what Gabriel is planning. God sent me so that you would have this sudden God-given insight that allows you to see everything come into place, and then you can discern the purpose, the overall plan. That this picture will suddenly become clear as you understand it. Kind of neat. I've experienced that kind of thing studying sometimes. It always seems like it's a God thing. Like, this is hard, this is hard, this is hard. Oh, wait, now it's not hard anymore. For some reason, everything just comes into place, and now it makes sense. Wow, who knew? and that happens to me sometimes. Nothing as important as what Daniel has here. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, word went out, and I've come to tell you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word. That's where the insight comes, and understand the vision. Okay, so here's this vision, and here comes the vision. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and for your holy city. This is verse 24. Verse 24 is a description of the purpose of the prophecy. What are we supposed to be seeing? What are we supposed to be looking for? In verse 24, Gabriel tells Daniel that there are 6 conditions that must be fulfilled. Okay, 70 weeks or 70 sevens are decreed. And people get all upset about the weeks, because 70 weeks would be about a year and a half. Okay. So the end of the world comes within a year and a half. No, that doesn't make sense. The Messiah will come and have nothing within a year and a half. Well, no, that didn't work out historically. Many of the so-called prophecy students who have attacked this passage and tried to understand it have a lot of trouble with it, because they start off by believing that the weeks have to be 7 days. And if they understood Aramaic and Hebrew, the related languages, they would look at this and understand that literally it says 77s. In every case where you see the word sevens in the Old Testament, you have to ask yourself the question, sevens of what? Sevens of minutes, of months, of days, what sevens of what? It often means 7 days. And that's a perfectly legitimate option in this. And when we're considering options, what it could be understood as 70 days, 70 months, 70 years, 77s. A 7 is simply 7 things. 70 times 7, what? What are we talking about? If the sevens are sevens of years, it yields a very interesting pattern, which ends up being quite important. The 69 of those years are going to take us down to the triumphal entry of Christ, the beginning of the last week of Jesus' life on earth. And at that point, as he comes into Jerusalem, he's offering himself as the king of the Jews. And during that week, the Jewish people who are in charge of Jerusalem at the time will reject their Messiah and arrange for him to be crucified. So the Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing, literally. And actually, that's after 69 times 7 years. Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. How did that work out? The 77s are decreed for your people and for your holy city. Let's understand that phrase. Your people would be Daniel's people. That is the nation that he is a part of. Daniel is an Israelite. He's part of the Jewish people. He's a part of the people of Israel. And so whatever else we understand about the 70 weeks, it is proper to think of this as 70 weeks for Israel. And so we're looking at something that is in the prophetic future from the point of view of Daniel, that is specifically about the people of Israel, your people, not necessarily the state or the nation within a state, but for the people. And the second part is for your holy city, which can only be Jerusalem. This is not a prophecy about the church. It has very little to do with the church, although you'll see where the church fits into all of this in just a bit. So Gabriel is saying, I'm going to tell you 77s, roughly 490 years from one point to another point. This is a bit of history that we'll have to work on. This is going to fit into the overall time of the Gentiles prophecy. These are parallels. They're both ultimately aiming at the same end point. So let's look at how it goes further. 6 specific conditions are going to be fulfilled that you will understand will be the end of time. Okay, 77s are decreed to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay, 6 specific things. 1, to finish transgression. A transgression is one of the words for sin in the Old Testament. Okay, transgression means to walk outside the line or to leave the path. If you're walking down a path through the jungle from one village to another, and you wander off into the jungle where the snakes are, you've done a transgression. You've left the path. That's what the word means. It's a specific term for sin. It refers to the individual commissions of sin. And when bad people go out and murder a bunch of people on the street, that's a series of transgressions. When good people fail to glorify God as well as they can, that's a transgression. Okay, so I know I've got transgressions in my life. When I read the news in the morning, I can see that the world is filled with transgressions. That's what makes the news. People going to war for stupid reasons, people stealing money, people taking bribes, people corruptly trying to control the world. There's all kinds of sin out there. And each individual decision to do those things is a transgression. So we'll know that the 6 conditions are filled when, 1, there isn't any more sin out there. When the morning news is suddenly extraordinarily boring because nothing is happening. There was nothing to report but a peaceful and happy city council meeting. Or that the governor is returning a greater proportion of property taxes this year or whatever. You know, wouldn't this all be nice? It would be nice to have nothing but good news. The news services wouldn't like that, but good news would be really nice, but we don't have any or very little. It's mostly bad news, and most of the bad news that we see is a result of transgressions. The active sinning in the human race seems to me to be continuing. If I were looking for a fulfillment of this prophecy, I would have to say it is not yet fulfilled. So we do another one. Number 2 is to put an end to sin. That is to erase the sin principle. And sin here is ra'ah, the evil principle that lives within us as a human race. Some of us are more sinful, commit more transgressions than others, but we've all got a problem with sin. And I know in my own life that that's not gone. I still have that problem. Just as Daniel recognized that he still had a problem. The saved people are not perfect, but we're sorry about our sin. That's the difference between saved people and unsaved people. Unsaved people sin at will and do anything they want to do. Some with more imitation righteousness than others, but the sin problem is universal. 3, to atone for wickedness, a final covering for the principle of ungodliness. And it has been said by some that the atonement for wickedness was accomplished fully on the cross. And I think the basis for an atonement was fully accomplished on the cross. But I believe the fulfillment of that promise is waiting for the beginning of heaven itself. It's hard to say that atonement that has been utterly successful would leave wickedness intact. I don't think that's possible at any rate. Some would argue that the atonement on the cross fulfills this prophecy, and I don't know whether or not to argue with that. Number 4 is to bring in, which means to personally, actively deliver, to physically deliver a thing. To bring in a thing is to deliver it and leave it on the doorstep. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Again, when I read the morning paper, when I read, actually, I read the computer, but when I read the news in the morning, I don't see a whole lot of everlasting righteousness going on. We're not there yet. To seal up vision and prophecy is number 5. You seal it up because it's complete. It's been fulfilled. So now we can seal it up. We're not there yet. There's still a great deal of biblical prophecy that is future. Unless you're one of those who believes that biblical prophecy has no application outside of the immediate moment. The prophet was speaking only to his own audience at the time, and there is no future sense to it. I don't believe that makes sense of the prophecies. To seal up vision and prophecy is to seal it up because it's complete. And then finally, to anoint the most holy. This can be understood either as the most holy one, which would be the Messiah, or the most holy place, which would be the Holy of Holies of the temple. And even the anointing of the so-called tribulation temple will not fulfill this. The prefab temple that the Jewish people in Israel right now are planning to build on the Temple Mount will be only a temporary fix. And it will not, in fact, be a fully anointed and actually holy place. It will be a temple allowed by the man of sin. So I don't think that can be the fulfillment. I think we're looking forward to the end of all of prophecy. So in 25 through 27, we're seeing a description of the fulfillment of the prophecy. So verse 24 is the actual prophecy itself. 77's 490 years are given for your people and for your city to accomplish these 6 things, mostly having to do with the fulfillment of prophecy and the dealing with the sin problem once and for all. There are many parts of that had to be put into place first. The coming of Christ to die for sin is obviously the climax of this redemption process. But the rest of the redemption process and the kingdom program of God are also going to be fulfilled here. So the 70 weeks are explained in 25, 6, and 7. And let me get this 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem until the coming of the anointed one, the prince, there will be 7 weeks. Oh, okay. Then for 62 weeks, it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in troubled times. Okay. The 7 weeks is interesting. The 7 and the 62, which add up to 69 weeks. So from the beginning of the command to rebuild the wall, Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 1 has the command from the Persian king to Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the wall. The Persian historical background of this would make this the 14th of March of 445 BC. And interpreters have kicked that around. How can we possibly know so well? Well, actually, we do have the Persian day books, so we know when these decrees were made. There's more wiggle room in the March 14th, 445 than some conservatives would like, but it's a question of a year or two. 100 years ago, there was a fellow named Sir Robert Anderson who wrote a book called The Coming Prince, in which he interprets these passages. And that's a good book. It's a difficult book, very technical. And he made he laid down the interpretation that the 70 weeks has to begin March 14, 445 BC, based on the astronomical dating of the day books of the Persian Empire. And that really has to be pretty close. The 7 weeks are the 49 years between roughly 445 BC and roughly 396 BC. That were the 49 years that were necessary to rebuild the wall. And this was a time that was full of trouble. When we read the book of Nehemiah, we see Nehemiah's quest, really, to return to Jerusalem and to organize the people and do the rebuilding of the wall. And they had enemies and all kinds of bad things, but we know it took about 49 years. So this part is perfectly literal, and it's very straightforward, and a literal understanding of the first 7 times 7 as 49 years ending in 396 BC can be confirmed. That part we know within a few months' time, either direction. Then from the end of the 7 weeks, there are 62 weeks during which the temple is up and functional. And at the end of that 69 weeks, 69 times 7, 483 years roughly, is the arrival of the Messiah. Okay, here he says that we're going to, after the 62, which is after the 69, which adds up to about 28 AD. And again, the scholars disagree on exactly how to date the events of the life of Christ. Anywhere from 28 to about 33 AD are positions that are held by various ones. For our purposes, it really doesn't matter very much. The people at the time of Christ recognized that the 483 years were coming close. And a literal understanding of this would be from 445 BC to roughly 28 to 32 or so AD is the fulfillment of 69 of the 70 weeks of Daniel. So what happens after the 69? Then for 62, and so on, 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be cut off after the 62 weeks. So sometime after his offer of the kingdom, he will be cut off and have nothing. All right, what is that? This is the first of several events that are going to happen after the 69. So the clock stops. Remember my illustration about the clocks of prophecy? This is the 70 weeks clock. This is where the clock stops and Messiah is cut off. The word translated cut off usually means to be cut off with a sword, like cut off a head, cut in half, whatever. It always refers to the death of the object of the cutting off. So the death of the Messiah is predicted here. The anointed one is cut off and will have nothing. This refers to the loss of an inheritance. So his purposed inheritance, the reason he was anointed to be the king, and therefore his inheritance is the kingdom. So the prediction here is after the 69 weeks, Messiah will be cut off, and at that point, there is no kingdom. The kingdom that was promised, the kingdom that is embodied in the king, is no longer with us. That kingdom has been postponed. For how long? Well, it doesn't say. It simply doesn't say. But that's the first note. Okay, he shall be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Okay, what's this about? A lot of things going on here. The city and the sanctuary will be destroyed after the Messiah is cut off and has nothing. Well, the first destruction of the temple after the death of Christ happens in 70 AD, roughly 40 years after the death of Christ. So that's longer. What happens in the 70th week? We started off saying it was 70 weeks, but now we've gotten, if we add another 7 years, that would take us up to what, 40 AD. And so the end of the world comes in 40 AD. How does that work? It actually doesn't work. There's no literal way to understand that. And so the non-literalists have come up with all kinds of allegorical ways of understanding this. I prefer to actually make sense of this. So we're told that the people of the prince who is to come. Who is the prince? Well, this is that willful king. This is not the Messiah. This is another character, and we keep coming back to him in the book of Daniel. This willful prince, the arrogant king, the hard-faced king, this worshiper of a god of fortresses. In the New Testament, the term Antichrist comes up. And we can use that term. So the people who are the source of the prince who is to come are going to destroy the city. Now, we all know that the Roman 10th Legion under Titus destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We all know that. So it has been traditional on the basis of that to say that the fourth beast, the nondescript beast of the earlier prophecies of Daniel, have to refer to Rome as the fourth kingdom. And I think I demonstrated 2 weeks ago that Rome as the fourth kingdom doesn't work very well. It doesn't fit history, and it doesn't fit the description of the fourth beast. So we ask with a little more detail, who exactly is the people of the prince who is to come? Was it the Romans? Was it Italians who made the trek to Jerusalem just for the purpose of destroying temples? Not so much. The Romans had a basic principle when they were going out and defeating their enemies. They understood that they were going to have to live with these people for a while. The Romans very rarely did something that they knew would make eternal enemies out of any subject nation. They had a tendency to leave the religious structures alone. So if there was a temple of whatever, some Greek god or some Gaulish god or some North African god, they just left it alone. They didn't care. Now, I would be happier if they did care, but the Romans just didn't care. They were what we call egalitarian. Everything was fine with them. They would tolerate anybody's religion as long as they paid the taxes on time, and as long as they didn't mess up the basic Roman governmental functions. So why would the Romans burn down the temple? When we read Josephus particularly, Josephus is a historian of the period who gives us an awful lot of good information about the fall of Jerusalem in 70. His history is considered the fundamental primary source during the period. To a lesser extent, the Roman historian Tacitus is brought into play. Tacitus is considered also primary source for the 1st century AD. He wrote shortly after 70 AD. He has several chapters about the war with the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem. What both Tacitus and Herodotus agree to several points. One is that the provincial legions, the legions of Rome that came from other than the Italian peninsula, those who were stationed all around the empire, during the 1st century were primarily made up of provincial troops. And so in any particular area, if we're talking about station along the Rhine River, boundary between the Roman Empire and the Germanic tribes, for example, there were Gaulish legions, and there were also, very interestingly, Germanic legions. People like this wave of people who became Swiss, the Vandals, the Goths, various other Germanic tribes who had migrated from Eastern Europe toward the West, looking for farmland and places to live. And many of those people had been recruited into the Roman army because it was a good way to make a living. And they were making more money operating as Roman soldiers than they would be farming. So there were a lot of things going on. One of the reasons that Rome in the West fell to the barbarians was because the barbarians were the army. They had taken most of those spots. They still had Italian officers, but the centurions and down were, for the most part, local non-Roman people. The same was true in the Middle East. So the legions, and there were 5 separate legions under Titus who were coming into this area, came primarily from Egypt and from Syria. Tacitus said the Syrians who made up the 10th Legion hated the Jews with the hatred of close neighbors. So it was Syrians. Now, the people of Syria are primarily, and always have been, Arabs. These are primarily people with a nomadic background. These are descendants of Ishmael and Ammon and Edom and Moab and a mixed group of others, the Amalekites and the Midianites and the rest of the eastern peoples who have mixed and matched all through the area. We can call simply Arabic peoples. The pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions go all the way back to that time. We know that those people were all over the place, and that throughout all of the Old Testament and into this period of the New Testament, these were people who hated the Jewish people. It had always been true. And Tacitus confirms that these legions were mostly made up of Syrians and Egyptians, people who, in general, hated the Jewish people. Josephus says that when Titus was commanding his armies and the armies finally broke through into the city of Jerusalem, a tremendous slaughter happened within the city. And that was a normal thing. And he told his centurions to try to keep a lid on it. And he went back to his headquarters tent and went to sleep for a night. He was wakened about an hour later with the news that some of his people had broken into the Temple Mount area and were prying the temple apart and trying to set fire to it. And the fires were burning in a variety of places. He sent back orders, Josephus tells us, to stop the destruction. And his army on the Temple Mount at that time refused to listen to orders and continued the rioting and destruction on the Temple Mount, killing everyone they could find and destroying the temple, stealing all of the gold. It was not Italians doing this. It was not Europeans doing this. It was most likely the 10th Legion, which was mostly Syrian. We can say then that the people of the Antichrist will be Arab. Now, that makes a lot of difference. This is one of the most important arguments in the whole book of Daniel. And those who argue that the people of the prince who is to come have to be European Romans. They have to be people from Italy. And therefore, the Antichrist has to be an Italian or at the very least a European. Build their argument largely on this passage. But the fact is, that isn't what this passage says. The people of the prince who is to come, who destroyed the temple, were Arabs. And the Arabs have become Muslim. This gives us the basis for arguing that the Antichrist comes from a Muslim background. If the fourth kingdom in the four-nation time of the Gentiles argument is Islam, the caliphate of Islam, then it makes sense that the final destructive, arrogant king has a Muslim background. Now, as we get further, we're going to learn more about this arrogant king, and we will see that he's not particularly a religious person. He is perhaps a Muslim of convenience or a Muslim by heritage, but he has no regard for the God of his fathers or for the one beloved by women, whatever that means. He's an interesting character, and we'll look at that. So what's going to happen here? There's first of all, one of the most important things to notice here is that the 69th week is done and Messiah is cut off. And after that, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the temple and the city. That happens in 70 AD. Therefore, there is a gap. There is an open space between the 69th and the 70th week. We can't say that they're continuous. They have to be spread apart. I have trouble getting my hands in the right spot. They have to be spread apart. And if we look at the rest of this, we're going to see that we are in that gap. Let me screen share. I'll show you the way this passage breaks down. There we go. Okay, here it comes. There it is. So 447 BC or 445, the beginning of the 69 weeks, the cross is at 0 or so, 28 AD, and there appears to be a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. That gap, which is not an accident, it's a deliberate part of history, is the church age. The 70th week comes at the end of the church age. And that 70th week is properly called the 70th week of Israel. This gap is obvious just by looking at history. Those who argue that the 70th week has to come immediately after the 69th have to be arguing that biblical prophecy is incoherent. If we start with the assumption that biblical prophecy is talking about real history in a real time, then we're forced to look at the actual events of history that come afterwards. And the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD doesn't happen right after the 69th. Otherwise, the 70th week would come in whatever 40 AD, and it didn't. And the destruction of Jerusalem happened, and then all of the rest of history happened. And we've got the entire church age unfolding during this time. It's to me, it seems clear, and honestly, I have trouble understanding why other interpreters can't see that this is what it actually says. Now, you can decide you're not going to believe what the Bible actually says. I'm okay with that. I think it's think it's bad policy, but I understand when people just don't want to believe the Bible. But to argue that the Bible clearly says that history ended in 40 AD, and it is therefore incoherent, is, I think, so. Let's assume that it makes some sense. So we go on. And he shall make, well, let's see, desolations are decreed. There could be a whole lot of trouble with the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. Then in verse, what am I looking at? Okay, verse 27. And here we're coming to the end of the passage. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Oh, we're back to those weeks. So there's a 7-year period that results from a strong covenant between the he, which is the prince who is to come, this harsh-faced, arrogant, willful king that we'll call the Antichrist. Antichrist makes a covenant with the many, the majority of the people of Israel at that time, for 1 7-year period. Now, people wonder, why do we insist that the tribulation period is 7 years long? It's because there's so many places where we speak of a 7-year period, where the 7 is divided into 2 3.5s. The covenant is made at the beginning of the 70th. In the middle of the 70th, the covenant is broken. He makes a strong covenant with many. A strong covenant means a solemn promise. And then he breaks his promise just a little later. And in this way, here's a human king who's not very different from politicians everywhere. You know how you can tell when a politician is lying? Yeah, that's right. His mouth moves. Here's one of those. And for half of the week, 3.5 years, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, so there's a strong covenant that's been made, a solemn covenant that you can now have a place of sacrifice on the Temple Mount. The people of Israel today are preparing a prefab temple to put up on that Temple Mount. They're preparing the elements of that temple, including a red heifer. They finally managed to breed a fully kosher red heifer, actually a little herd of red heifers in the hills around Jerusalem. They're ready to go right now. Today, they're ready to put that temple up, and people get all excited about this. Oh boy, that means the eternal state is beginning. No, it means a time of terrible desolation and tribulation for Israel is about to begin. The 70th week is not a happy time. It's definitely focused on Israel. So we make a 7-year covenant. We break the covenant in the middle. After half the week, he'll put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate. Okay, this is probably a reference to what Antiochus Epiphanes did in 169 or so BC, the desolation of the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar and erecting a statue of Zeus in the temple. The Antichrist in the middle of the 70th week will do a kind of abomination of desolations that will be very obvious to the Jewish people surviving at that time, until the decreed end is poured out on the desecrator, the desolator. Okay. At the end of this 70th week, the Antichrist character, this probably Muslim willful king, who has finally come up with a peace solution for Israel, will be destroyed. Well, by what? Well, by the second coming of Christ. The 70th weeks, like the time of the Gentiles, takes us down to the second coming of Christ. The second coming of Christ is accompanied by a tremendous war, a war of all of the nations against Israel, to be fought in the hills and in the valleys around Jerusalem. The battles that we call a variety of things, Armageddon, the most common. And God will intervene in that battle by the sending of his son, the Messiah, with a sword in his mouth, of all things, to destroy the enemies of Israel. And that will usher in the kingdom age. The king will arrive in triumph, will destroy his enemies, and for 1,000 years, a perfect kingdom on earth will happen. We'll talk about that a little bit next week when we get a little farther in. So what we've got here is the second of the, well, actually, you can see here, the second and third clocks. The first clock of prophecy is the time of the Gentiles. We can see that began with Nebuchadnezzar and with the kingdom of Babylon, followed by Persia, followed by the Greco-Roman power, up until 640 AD, when Islam took over Jerusalem. And one rising from that caliphate of the end time, the Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel, allowing for the reconstruction of the temple. That is the 70th week of Israel. It is also the tribulation period, which climaxes with the destruction of the enemies of Israel. In between that 69th and 70th week is the church age. We are currently in the church age. It is this structure that allows for Paul to say, that day of the Lord will not come to you people in Thessalonica until the man of sin is revealed, until the apostasy of the church takes place. So there's a couple of things that have got to happen. We don't see the man of sin yet, but perhaps he's out there lurking off stage. And we do see, I believe, the apostasy of the church. And it's getting worse. So where are we? I think we're getting close, but I don't know how close. Nobody does. But I believe that we are regularly getting there. All right, let me see if I can make this go away. And I'm going to unmute us all. All right. Well, I know that's tough stuff, tough material. And you will find that there are an awful lot of godly evangelical commentators who take a different position than I do. Now, my position is typically called dispensational. That is, I believe that Israel is different from the church. And interpreters who decided that Old Testament Israel is simply an early form of the church are often very good teachers and godly men. And I appreciate their work. I disagree with them, but I appreciate their work. I think it's clear that Israel and the church are different. If that's true, then it makes perfect sense of the book of Daniel. So we're looking at time of the Gentiles and the 70 weeks of Israel, counting all the way down to the second coming. The church age counts down to the beginning of the 70th week. And that's the primary reason that conservatives who hold to a rapture event, place that at the beginning of the 70th week and of the tribulation period. Those who place the rapture elsewhere have got their reasons for doing that, but they're not, strictly speaking, trying to make sense of the words of Scripture themselves. They're usually working from a theological presupposition. And that's where we are. That's where we are. Next week, we're going to cover a couple of chapters. Chapter 10 is interesting in its own right, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time with 10, but I do want to look at the details of chapters 11 and 12. And we're going to work our way through that. 10, 11, and 12 are going to take 2 weeks. I'm not exactly sure where it would break it, but that will happen next week. Thank you for being here. I always appreciate our time together. So bye-bye for now. Love everybody.
Thanks, Dr. John.
Hey, my pleasure.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
you.
Bye,
Dr.
John.
John.
you, thank you.
Opo.
Good evening.
There's Christy. Hi, Christy.
Ciao
Okay.
tutti.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Let's see if I can find that. All right. Ciao, ciao.